Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas by Sylviane A. Diouf, narrated by Jair Bush. Introduction to the 15th Anniversary Edition. In 1998, when Servants of Allah was first published, I could not have imagined that I would be writing a new introduction to the volume 15 years later. 3 years earlier, I could not even imagine this book would ever exist. I had started writing it in French, certain I would find a receptive publisher in Paris, only when, to my utter surprise, no one shared my enthusiasm, to say the least, did I decide to start all over. 15 years later, Servants of Allah is still here, and Allah in Kulari, its Turkish version, has gone into 2 editions. As for Serviteur d'Allah, it has yet to exist. Nothing has changed there. But change there has been, and plenty of it. Between 1998, the end of the 20th century, and today, roughly a decade and a half into the 21st, a new political, religious, and social reality unexpectedly transformed a book on a hitherto obscure part of slavery history into what its publisher has deemed a surprise bestseller. Sadly, it took a tragedy to alter the landscape, literally and figuratively. In the aftershock of 9/11, against all expectations, an authentic interest in Islam and Muslims manifested itself. Community centers, churches, schools, universities, libraries, museums, and international organizations solicited scholars, religious figures, and ordinary believers asking for information, explanations, and responses to fear and incomprehension. Servants of Allah, along with other scholarship on Islam, Muslims, American Muslims, and Muslims in America, became an integral part of this process, especially as it made clear that Islam and Muslims were not recent arrivals, but had been part of the American fabric from its very beginning. The realization that Islam had deep roots in the United States was often a stunning discovery to non-Muslims and Muslims alike. That Islam was brought not only to the United States, but also to the entire Western Hemisphere, from Cuba to Peru, and from Guadeloupe to Guyana, and had been maintained by enslaved Africans, was nothing short of mystifying for most people. That these Africans had written documents in Arabic was a fact that shattered ingrained stereotypes. There was a genuine interest in the history in and of itself, but there was also a larger narrative into which it fit. The book appealed to the voices that sought to bring or reinforce ecumenism, tolerance, and fraternity among peoples of various faiths at a time when these qualities were in short supply. By putting Islam in a hemispheric context since the early 1500s, it showed that Islam was the second monotheist religion introduced into all parts of the New World after Catholicism and before Judaism and Protestantism, thus exposing its longevity, its continental reach, and its followers' resilience, even under the worst circumstances. In the face of mounting suspicion of foreignness and supposed anti-Americanism, Muslims were eager to demonstrate that Islam was as much an American religion as any, one that had coexisted with others quietly for centuries, and whose followers had contributed to the development of the country. Perhaps more than anything else, at that moment, it was this mainstreaming of Islam and Muslims that attracted those who found themselves on the defensive, asked to demonstrate their Americanness. But there was still another dynamic going on within the Muslim community itself. Many Muslims who embraced the centuries-old history of Islam in the Americas as their heritage were not of West African descent. White and Hispanic Americans and men and women whose roots were in the Middle East and Asia were quick to claim West African Muslims as their brothers and sisters in faith, although some, by no means all, among them had failed to acknowledge sub-Saharan Africa as a land of Islam, had ignored African Muslims, and had shown no previous interest in African American history. Yet, now they proclaim their connection to the people and the history. West African Muslims enthusiastically welcomed a historical narrative they could relate to. The events, religious and political figures, and celebrated places of learning from Al-Mami Abdul Qadir Kane and Usman Dan Fodio to the Qadariyya, Pir, and Timbuktu were already familiar, but placed in an American-wide historical perspective, they took on an all-new dimension. African American Muslims, who often complained of being marginalized by their co-religionists for being converts, even when they were second or third generation Muslims, and supposed heirs to homegrown proto-American Islamic movements considered blasphemous by orthodox Islam, embraced the history of African Islam in the Americas as their own. It became proof of their legitimacy and ancient lineage as Muslims. For generations, the Black Church has been seen as the historical religious foundation of African Americans, but Islam complicated the narrative. Muslims could assert an even earlier religious heritage, and it was one that, unlike Protestantism, had its roots in Africa. Granted, there were some Catholics among the West Central Africans who had been deported to the Americas, but Islam had been implanted in sub-Saharan Africa at least 5 centuries before the Portuguese sent missionaries to Congo. Surprisingly, as non-African American Muslims had been quick to embrace the story and make it their own, many African American non-Muslims at the time did not appropriate a narrative that was clearly their own and filled gaps in their history. Asked why, they often responded that they did not perceive it so much as African and African diasporan history, but rather as Muslim history, and therefore they did not feel any particular connection to it. Over the past few years, the social, political, and religious climate has changed once again, tremendously. Muslims, Islam, jihadi terrorism, and the war on terror have been relentlessly in the news and have become embedded in our daily life in ways that were once unthinkable. There is a climate of Muslim fatigue among many people, of Islamophobia among others, but there is also continuing interest. Until 2001, Muslims were, for the most part, little visible, hence the curiosity following 9/11. But today, precisely because they, and the conflation of some and most is unfortunately readily done, are omnipresent and highly visible, the attention has not abated. Non-Muslims interested in the topic seek to know more about a religion and its followers who so dominate the news cycle and the global political landscape. Muslims themselves, for a variety of reasons, have been looking for more knowledge about their faith and its international history. Thus, although times have changed, the interest is still there, and research on African Muslims during slavery continues, albeit in a quite different environment. When I wrote Servants of Allah so many years ago, it was not because I knew something, but because I wanted to know. I wrote the book to find answers to my questions. The absence, the invisibility of the Muslims in the hundreds of books on slavery I had read over the years was perplexing. Since they lived in areas that had been involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and the ethnic groups they belonged to were listed in the numerous tables historians had compiled, why did they disappear as Muslims? How could the religious dimension, an essential part of people's lives and identity, simply vanish once Africans had reached the Americas? The question, or rather the absence of response, was all the more bewildering as a whole segment of academic research had been devoted to showing that African religions had not disappeared in the New World. Obviously, then, only Islam had evaporated and had done so immediately. I was familiar with the Brazilian Muslims since I had read Pierre Verger's seminal and illuminating Flux et reflux de la traite des négres entre la Gulf de Benin et Bahia de Todos os Santos du XVIIe au XIXe siècle, published as Trade Relations Between the Bight of Benin and Bahia from the 17th to the 19th Century by Ibadan University Press in 1976. They had remained Muslims, created vigorous communities, organized conspiracies, and launched a major revolt. Why would the Muslims have survived as Muslims only in Brazil? What had happened to the others? How could their faith have manifested itself, even if not in such an obvious manner? As a descendant of Omar Khalifal, the founder, in 1611, of the Islamic University of Pire in Senegal, I also had questions about the fate of their literacy and the manuscripts they could have produced. My interest was not limited to a particular area. I wanted to unearth stories not from just one country, but from all over the Americas to get a better picture of Muslims' place in the diaspora. The search brought more interrogations, but also answered more questions than I initially had. I uncovered a world whose many parts had never been brought together, and it was an exciting discovery. Thus, by design, Servants of Allah had a very large scope and time frame: the Western Hemisphere and the entirety of the slavery period. For the United States, the studies of African Muslims that had preceded this book consisted of the biographies of two individuals, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, Job bin Solomon, and Ibrahima Abd al-Rahman. More broadly, Alan D. Austin's 1984 sourcebook had gathered documentation on Muslims in Jamaica and the United States, and several scholars had, since the early 1900s, focused on Muslims in Brazil. All these studies had brought forth invaluable information. However, Muslims appeared as in silos, their particular stories unconnected, which made them and their experience appear exceptional. It could well have been proposed that only a few Muslims were transported to a handful of Western countries, or that only a small minority remained Muslims. A hemispheric approach was needed to provide a large framework that connected glimpses of lives and fragments of stories scattered over 3 continents into one narrative that could reveal a previously hidden dimension of African history, diasporan history, and Muslim history. This perspective helped recover, as Timothy W. Marr has stressed, lost dimensions of both the diasporic history of Africans in the Americas and the religious beliefs and practices of enslaved Americans. With the exploitation of sources from Antigua, the Bahamas, Belize, Brazil, Carriacou, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Guadeloupe, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, Martinique, Montserrat, Panama, Peru, St. Croix, Tobago, Trinidad, and the United States, Servants of Allah established the widespread presence of African Muslims in the Western Hemisphere. But more importantly, it revealed the upholding and the manifestations of the religion on a large scale. This first broad observation of a historical reality that had not received any attention before evidenced the fact that Islam was indeed a diasporic religion whose expressions were widespread, distinctive, visible, and recognizable enough to be recorded in a variety of written sources and commented on by colonists and travelers throughout the Americas. Through these observations and other materials, it became clear that Muslims could no longer be envisioned as isolated, idiosyncratic individuals or small groups, but rather must be seen as an extensive population, as much part of the Ummah, the world community of Muslims, as any, whose commonality was not based on ethnicity, language, or shared geographic origin, but on religion. It also signified that, seen from that angle, even though Muslims were a minority in the Americas, they were a significant one among Africans whose religions were based on ethnicity. Moreover, the hemispheric perspective showed that there was a Muslim continuity, a Muslim way of behaving, dressing, rejecting conversion, or becoming pseudo-converts, and expressing one's faith, for example, that manifested itself across European political, religious, and linguistic boundaries. This new approach revealed fresh possibilities of scholarship. It helped expand the scope of study of African peoples' religions beyond the obvious. It enabled scholars to move outside of the traditional way of studying Africana religions, which is to focus on the Black church in the United States and African-derived religions in the rest of the hemisphere. Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, and Vodun in Haiti, for example. The fact that there was a religion that had preceded them all and was practiced on Virginian farms and Cuban plantations, in Peruvian cities and Jamaican towns, could no longer be ignored and had to be studied in a systematic manner with the appropriate tools. As much as Muslims in the Americas were part of the Ummah, they were also part of the enslaved world, and non-Muslims not only were well aware of their presence, but were sometimes influenced by Islam and its followers. The work which servants of Allah began of revisiting the Neo-African and African-derived religions continues to be imperative, as some have been shown to have integrated into their liturgy Arabic vocabulary, specific Muslim rituals, and the acknowledgement of Muslims themselves. By the same token, the wide-scale Muslim dimension forces us to reassess the issue of African retentions in all aspects of the African diaspora's culture, as some elements are clearly and indisputably Islamic, while others are more hidden. As shown in this book, Muslims' literacy, a distinctive feature, also reshapes the discussion about slave narratives. This literacy enabled the creation of written sources by the Africans themselves on a much wider scale and covering more genres than what was produced by the few people who wrote in European languages, such as Phyllis Wheatley and Olada Equiano. Muslims' production was not restricted to a handful of individuals writing for a Western audience, but involved thousands of Africans scattered across the New World, writing primarily for their own. Theirs was a completely different exercise, which, when properly translated and interpreted, provides new understanding of their intellectual, social, and religious lives, their educational attainments prior to deportation, and their personal and collective perspectives. Moreover, their writings evidence or hint at efforts at keeping the community on the right path, at preserving orthodoxy, and at extolling the value of education, self-discipline, and literacy. A large scope shows the diversity and commonalities of Muslims' written output. A narrow focus on the United States would have yielded a limited number of manuscripts and records of no longer extant documents. An autobiography and letters by Omar ibn Said, a letter, not recovered, by Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, a short religious piece by Bilali Mohammed, and simple writings on demand by Ibrahima Abd al-Rahman and Charno. But when other parts of the Americas are taken into account, a much wider range of literature comes to light. Autobiographical sketches, religious texts of various types, Qurans, plans for revolt, talismans, personal letters, letters to the authorities, and official petitions. These various documents were written not only in Arabic, but also in mixed Arabic Ajami, any language written in Arabic script. What this perspective provides us is the understanding that particular types of texts that have not been found in one specific place probably existed nevertheless, but disappeared just like the rest of the African's meager possessions. For example, given the extensive use of protective talismans by Sufis in Africa and elsewhere, it would be hard to imagine that they did not survive in the Americas. Evidence from Brazil, Cuba, and Saint-Domingue, for example, shows that they did, and there is no cogent reason why they would not have existed in other parts of the hemisphere. Therefore, their absence in, say, South Carolina does not mean Muslims had somehow decided to give them up or that no one man capable of making them, including charlatans, had ever landed in Charleston, but rather that they have been lost or that some may still be found. The variety of documents that have come to light also evidences the range of skills and knowledge that Muslims brought with them. Some people could read but not write, others were semi-literate, and still others were well educated. John Hunwick has noted that Omar ibn Said had not reached such heights as would have made him into a scholar in his own right. He was literate but not learned. In contrast, the analysis of a number of documents by Nicolai Dobronravin of St. Petersburg State University has revealed the high level of erudition of some Muslims. Quotations from Qasida al-Burda, an ode of praise for the Prophet Muhammad, by the eminent 13th century Egyptian Sufi al-Busiri, and from the Maqamat al-Hariri, a collection of 50 short stories written by Abu Muhammad al-Qasim ibn Ali al-Hariri, 1054 to 1122, of Basra, Iraq, evidence the degree of scholarship of some enslaved West African Muslims. Besides diversity, there is also commonality. All extant manuscripts are Muslim-specific. In other words, even when they are not religious texts, they refer to Islam and to the writers being Muslims, and they contain surahs, prayers, and Arabic salutations. Clearly, their religious identity was central, essential to Muslims. It could not be disassociated from who they were and what they did. The story of the African Muslims also allows us to go beyond the creolization model, defined schematically as the mixing of cultures, including religion, and languages in the early colonial world. In many ways, Muslims, because of the exigency of their religion, strove to remain outside of, not mix with, the cultural and religious models imposed by the West and Christianity. This inclination showed, whenever possible, in their dress, physical appearance, and diet, in the establishment of underground Quranic schools, in the continued writing of Islamic texts, and even Qurans, in the retention of their names, and in their efforts to go back to Africa. As Paul E. Lovejoy has stressed, Muslims demonstrated that the range of cultural adjustments possible for slaves was much more complex than has often been supposed. The study of enslaved Muslims thus contributes to advancing scholarship in a number of disciplines and themes. However, in the first edition of Servants of Allah, I deplored the lack of interest in such research, especially in the United States, where more studies on slavery have been produced than anywhere else in the Americas. Lack of resources cannot explain this oversight because of the existence of published records on 18th and 19th century Muslims. Additional material was made available in the early 20th century. W.E.B. Du Bois had mentioned the Muslims of Bahia and their 1835 revolt. Strangely enough, he thought they attempted to enthrone a queen in 1915. The reminiscences of formerly enslaved men and women in Georgia describing the behavior of their grandparents, who could be readily identified as Muslims, had been published by the Works Progress Administration in 1940, and the Journal of Negro History had put out the first study of the Ben Ali Diary that same year. Lorenzo Turner's book on Gullah, published in 1949, evidenced a number of Islamic names in vogue in the Sea Islands. By the end of the 1960s, Philip Curtin had edited Africa Remembered, which presented information on and biographies of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, enslaved in Maryland, Salih Bilali, Georgia, and Abu Bakr al-Sadiq, Jamaica. In 1968, Douglas Grant had published The Fortunate Slave, an illustration of African slavery in the early 18th century, about Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. Newbell Puckett's research had produced a list of hundreds of African names, many of them distinctly Islamic. The 1977 biography of Ibrahima Abd al-Rahman fell into an academic black hole, stressed the author, who remained mystified by the cold shoulder that the academic world gave the book. And Alan Austin's work did not generate the interest it deserved, let alone new research either. Writers and artists, for their part, gave the subject scant attention. Alex Haley did not make Islam a meaningful element of his ancestors' life, as it most probably was, and did not mention the existence of other Muslims in Roots. Toni Morrison's 1977 Song of Solomon contains the verses, Solomon and Raina Bilali Shalut, Yaruba Medina Muhammad too, Nestor Kalina Saraka Cake, with no explanation and no other reference to Muslims. Strangely, this recitation of the names of a Muslim family on Sapelo Island, Georgia, and other allusions to Islam and Muslims are woven into a song created by Morrison, who set her story in Virginia. Although Julie Dash's 1991 movie Daughters of the Dust opens with the praying of an elderly Muslim, an overt acknowledgement of the Muslims of the Sea Islands, it does not pursue their story any further. Steven Spielberg's 1997 Amistad features, for a second, a few Muslims praying on the ship deck, but at no point is there any allusion to the prisoners' religions except when it comes to the Christian convert. There were Muslims on the Amistad, as has been documented by Richard Madden, who testified on their behalf in Connecticut on November 11, 1839. He spoke with one of them and repeated in the Arabic language a Mohammedan form of prayer in the words Allah Akbar, or God is great, were immediately recognized by the Negro, and some of the words of the said prayer were repeated after him by the Negro. That deponent addressed another Negro, standing by the former, in the ordinary terms of Oriental salutation, Salam alaikum, or peace to you, and the man immediately replied, Alaikum salam, or with you be peace. One of the young men on board, Ba'u, said that his father was a Marabu, learned man. Considering the number of books on various aspects of slavery published in the United States in the past 30 years, Research on Muslims is thus strikingly limited. Part of the issue may be that a focus on Christianity has obscured the existence and role played by other religions. To overstate Christianity's dominance before emancipation minimizes or plainly ignores the diverse.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?